Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode number 80 of the BeerSmith Homebrewing Show. It's late April 2014, and my guest today is Chaz Benedict to talk about oxygen in beer and keeping your beer fresh. Today's podcast is brought to you by the BeerSmith discussion forum at beersmith.com/forum. Join over 23,000 home and professional brewers in discussing extract, all grain, and professional brewing. Ask questions, share your recent brews, and enjoy topics on home and professional brewing. You can join the discussion today by going to beersmith.com/forum. And also by Craft and Beer Brewing Magazine, the newest magazine for home and professional brewers at beerandbrewing.com. Enjoy practical advice from brewing experts, reviews, and in-depth coverage of brewing trends. Get your subscription to Craft and Beer Brewing Magazine today at beerandbrewing.com. Now let's join Chaz for this week's interview. Today on the show, I'd like to welcome Chaz Benedict. Chaz is a manager at Hatch Company, where he spent decades studying and refining the measurement of oxygen in beer. He has a degree in chemistry from the UC Santa Cruz, and he's a member of the American Society of Brewing Chemists Technical Committee. His blog is at tapintohatch.com. That's hatch with no T, tapintohatch.com. It is really nice to have you on the show, Chaz.
Thanks, Brad. It's nice to be here.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. So, in between rainstorms in San Francisco, it's a nice place to be.
Well, we had a sunny day here on the East Coast for a change.
That's good.
It's been
That's really good.
We've been fighting bad weather all year. Well, Chaz, you started out working in underwater robotic vehicles. How did you make the big transition from underwater robotic vehicles into beer brewing?
Well, I probably have one of the most accidental and serendipitous careers that has ever existed. But essentially what happened was I was working for a company that was being almost 100% funded by Advanced Defense Research Project money from the Department of Defense. And we needed to go into peacetime. The DoD said, hey, we're not going to support you guys anymore. And so we started looking at oxygen scavenging closures using some of the technology that we'd created. And we were approached by the closure manufacturer Zapata Corporation. Zapata came in and looked at what we were doing and said, hey, we want to partner with you. So I was on the development team that developed the first oxygen scavenging closures that Zapata manufactured and were available in the U.S. to the brewing industry.
So what's an oxygen scavenging enclosure? So
the theory was, and this is way more true back then than it is today, that in bottled beer especially, there's a lot of oxygen that gets imparted into the beer during the filling process. Fillers have gotten so good today that it's really not as critical as it was when we were doing this back in the early 1990s. But the bottom line is that these closures were designed to take oxygen out of the beer so that the beer would have the potential to have a longer shelf life.
So it's all about freshness then, huh?
It's all about freshness, and it's all about trying to minimize oxygen exposure and minimize the amount of oxidation that happens to the beer.
So is that your passion in beer brewing too?
It really has become that. I mean, I learned so much as we tried to quantify it back then, and learned how to quantify it, and learned all the problems, and then it kind of came down to, okay, we have this great tool. How can we use it to help people quantify fillers and what's going on in the filling operation? And then it sort of has worked its way up. And as I've gotten more and more involved in the industry, specifically the American Society of Brewing Chemists, the rest of brewing became very interesting to me as well, because it's a lot more than just oxidation. Oxidation is a significant part of what happens to your beer once it's packaged. But up until that, there's a lot of cool stuff that goes on too. So it sparked my interest than is my interest, I guess.
Well, what are some of the other major contributors to beer freshness?
Well, I think in terms of beer freshness, oxygen exposure probably is the number one thing. But in terms of flavor stability and the kinds of things that people need to be looking at, the my kind of guess with homebrewers, and I say this from having judged a couple of very small groups of people who've said, hey, come taste our beer, we want some feedback, that probably wort aeration and making sure that you have enough oxygen in your wort to keep the yeast happy in the beginning of the fermentation process may be a really critical thing.
So talk for a minute about aeration.
So yeast, when yeast go to start metabolizing the things that are in the beer, the first thing that they need to do is they need the air and the oxygen to grow and to get that kind of critical growth factor going on. Once that they start growing, and once that starts happening, then they go into kind of an aerobic fermentation. And at that point, how they assimilated the amino acids and what kinds of things they've done to stay healthy so that all those yeast cells that multiplied are viable and have good vitality, a huge amount of that depends upon how much oxygen there is in that wort stream. And what I found with everybody in the last homebrew group that I worked with was that nobody had aerated their wort stream enough, and you could kind of taste some of the off flavors that were associated with the potential for not enough O2 during that initial phase.
One of the big problems too is, doesn't the boil put most of the oxygen out of the wort?
So exactly, and you don't want any oxygen in the wort when it's hot, because sort of the kinetics of oxidation is that the hotter the temperature, the faster those reactions will take place. So, if I was a home brewer, I would probably boil my water pretty vigorously before I added anything to it, just to drive the oxygen out of it. And then I would make sure it was cooled and exposed to as little oxygen as possible before I started my aeration process.
So you're talking about hot side aeration there? You don't really want oxygen during the boil, right?
You don't want oxygen during the boil, no.
But you need a ton of it after the boil.
Exactly. Yep. And if you're a home brewer and mostly what you're doing is you're aerating with air as opposed to oxygen, then probably the yeast you have will let you feed it just about as much oxygen as you want, during that initial, I don't know what the time frame would be, 15, 20 minutes, a half an hour. That's something you could probably speak to better than me, but clearly it's hard to over aerate your wort. And so probably err on the excessive side and just don't aerate it to the point that it foams over.
So what are some of the methods that an average home brewer might be able to use to aerate their wort?
Well, that's something I'm not 100% sure about. Whatever you do, it's got to be really sanitary. And having a sanitary air supply is probably important to some extent as well. But, I guess if I was home brewing, I'd be starting off looking at things like massive aquarium pumps or things like that. But again, not being a home brewer, I don't know the answers.
That's okay. Well, let's talk about the finished beer. Now, you don't want oxygen, obviously, in the finished beer.
That's correct. So, in your finished beer, the amount of freshness, so to speak, and how long it'll last is all going to be predicated by two main things. One is the storage temperature, and the other is going to be the amount of oxygen in the beer. So if you are looking at high levels of O2 and you store it warm, or say you're a brewery and you put it on a truck that goes out at 110 degrees Fahrenheit, you're going to kill that beer in a couple of days. If you're a brewer who's brewing at really low levels, you might have a shelf life of 3 to 6 months. That's going to work pretty well for you.
So for me, I wouldn't want to store my beer in the garage in the middle of summer, right?
No, and you never want to leave your beer in the trunk of the car or anything. Absolutely not.
But we didn't didn't talk much about how does the oxygen end up getting into the finished beer, either in bottles or kegs?
No, good question. So in your bottles or your kegs, when you start out with that bottle or keg, it's full of air. And so unless you go to some extent to try and evacuate the air out of the bottle or keg with CO2 or nitrogen or just some kind of an inert gas, when you go to fill it, you're going to mix that air in with the product. And as your beer mixes with the air, it's going to hold it. Then you've also got the issue of headspace. And in breweries, what they do is they shoot a very high stream, high pressure jet of water into the headspace of the beer to cause the beer to foam up. And when the beer foams, it knocks the oxygen out of the headspace. So for the home brewer, if you really had the perfect setup, you'd evacuate your bottles, maybe fill them, and then you take a rubber hose or something and whack the side of the bottle to get it to overfoam, and then put your closure on it. And that would be probably the best you could do.
Well, you need a little bit of oxygen typically if you're bottling, because most of us naturally carbonate when we bottle, right?
Well, that's another interesting question, because I've worked with a lot of these breweries who do, so they partially carbonate. If you really look at a typical beer coming out of an American brewery, your carbonation level is about 2.5 volumes, 2.5 to 3, 2.5 to 2.85 probably volumes per volume of CO2 per volume of beer. And what a lot of these big craft brewers do is they maybe carbonate at 1.1, 1.2 volumes, and then they add in, 2.1 or 2.2 volumes, and then they add yeast. And what they found is that the lower that initial O2, the better their flavor stability. So for a home brewer, I don't know what you need, but I don't think it's very much O2 in there.
So you probably don't need much headspace at all, right?
Probably not. No. I think the reason they leave headspace in beer is more to make sure that bottles don't blow up if the packages get hot, or
that's an important consideration, because I know some of my early brews actually blew up in the kitchen. It was stout everywhere. It was unbelievable.
That's probably not too good. Yeah.
I was a little inexperienced then.
Yeah.
So, how do you actually measure the amount of oxygen that's in your finished beer? I know commercial breweries are very concerned with this.
So there are oxygen analyzers made, and unfortunately you need fairly sophisticated equipment to do it, because you're measuring at the detection limits of the instruments, or at least in the breweries, you're often measuring the detection limits of the instruments. So you're measuring down in the part per billion levels. The analyzers are probably the most difficult thing about measuring in beer is that it's carbonated, so it's under pressure. You got a lot of CO2 to deal with. And ultimately what you have to do is you've got to figure out, okay, how can I get this, how can I get the beer to the sensor in a way that the CO2 doesn't off-gas? Because if the CO2 comes out of solution off-gases, then the oxygen will come out as well.
Right. How does the oxygen itself lead to stale beer?
Well, that's something that's probably been well studied, but still isn't well understood in terms of exactly what happens. But essentially what you've got lots of trace metals that come from either the water or from enzymes in proteins in the yeast. And these trace metals catalyze an oxygen to attack some of the larger molecules, the polyphenolics, and some of the flavor molecule in the beer. And
I had Charlie Bamforth on a little while ago, and he mentioned copper is a good example.
Copper, iron, copper, yeah, all those. I mean, pretty much any of those sort of trace metals. Copper is probably the most reactive with oxygen. In fact, the early oxygen scavenging closures used a combination of ascorbic acid, which is vitamin C, or the sodium ascorbate version of vitamin C, and copper sulfate as the catalyst to get the sodium ascorbate to work.
He was urging me not to use a giant copper brewing kettle.
Probably smart.
think most of them have gone stainless now, but a lot of us still do use copper in the cooling coils. You know, we use an immersion chiller typically made out of copper.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think if you're cooling, it's probably not going to be as reactive as if it's hot. Yeah.
Oh.
So.
What are some of the ways to minimize the oxygen in the finished beer?
Well, I think the main thing is purge those bottles, fob them if you can. When I was watching, I don't know if you saw this, but when President Obama started brewing beer and they had the
White House
videos, the White House videos, and I was watching that and I looked at the open 5-gallon buckets and I was just kind of going, oh my God. Try and minimize any mixing that you do with air. If there's a way that you can get it out of your sort of final fermentation, let the yeast go to the bottom and somehow siphon it off the top. Unless you really want to have your beer clear, I think that would work really well.
Yeah, I think most of us that homebrew typically use a secondary that we'll siphon the wort off after the primary fermentation's done.
Yeah, so siphon it off into a container that is, if you can, a container that's evacuated. Maybe if you're using a 5-gallon bucket, create some kind of a lid over the top of it. Maybe something clean using saran wrap or something like that. Just
some of us have access to CO2 as well because we do keg.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you've got access to CO2, definitely use that to flush things out.
What do you think about oxygen purifying caps or oxygen absorbing caps that beer bottle caps?
Well, I think I have a love-hate relationship with them because I think that from the standpoint of acting as an oxygen barrier, they work fantastically. And for homebrewers, they might work well if their O2 levels are really high. But I think for most commercial breweries, I'm not really convinced that the scavenging part makes that much of a difference because these guys are doing such a good job. Most of them are doing such a good job of getting the O2 out of their beer. I guess my bottom line with anything like that is see if they make a difference to you. Package some of your beer with them and some without them, and do some tests. Maybe do some blind tests where somebody packages containers of each and says, "Hey, can you tell the difference? And what do you think of this versus that?"
Well, we covered bottling pretty well. We haven't really started talking about kegging yet. What about those of us that keg?
So for those of you that keg, absolutely the same kinds of things that we talk about with bottling. Flush those kegs out with CO2 really well before you fill them with beer, and I think that will help you. And then kegging is a different animal because you're probably keeping those kegs nice and cool. So if you're keeping them cool, that's going to help you a lot as well.
Yeah, I think the other advantage of kegging is you can pretty easily purge as you're filling.
Yeah.
Most of the keg systems that we use have a relief valve on the top, and you can purge all the oxygen out after you've filled it up.
Yeah, no, that would work. That would work pretty well.
Now, I know you've done some work with CO2 purity, and this is an interesting topic I hadn't really considered, which is, how pure is the CO2 we're getting in our bottle?
Well, CO2 purity is an interesting thing because if you look at injecting CO2. So this is where you've got CO2 and you're actually injecting it into a process pipe at a very high pressure. You need much, much purer CO2 than if you're sparging, if you're just bubbling the CO2 up through your products.
Well, I think most of us use it to carbonate, pressure carbonate over time. But it's a slow process.
It's a slow process.
Yeah, typically you're running at 13 psi or something like that, and you throw it in the fridge and you let it sit for a week or so, and you get the nice fine bubbles.
So you overpressure the container and then let it sit.
Actually, we just set it to normal keg pressure and leave it leave it in the fridge. That's how most homebrewers do it, and you get a nice even carbonation after a few days.
It's probably, I'd have to run and do the math and kind of look at the numbers on that, but it's probably a lot like injecting, in that you're putting in a mass of oxygen, a certain weight of oxygen, and it would make the CO2 purity pretty important. Over long periods of time, it would make the CO2 purity extremely important.
Well, that's what I was wondering. How, let's say I go buy one of these or get one of these bottles from my typical gas distributor, that's providing CO2 to the soda stores and so on. What kind of purity would I expect?
Well, that's pretty interesting question, because I've gotten gas that was phenomenally pure, and then I've seen gas that was really, really impure. I would hope that anything you get would be greater than 99.9%, but I've seen things that are 98%, and I've seen things that are 98.98%. So it's almost a crapshoot unless you buy certified gas, and certified gases are pretty darned expensive.
Yeah, I don't think most of us actually go and buy certified gas.
Yeah.
Well, what other considerations come into play when we're packaging beer to try and preserve freshness?
Well, I think, sanitation is going to be one of those, probably the biggest issue that anybody's going to run up against is sanitation. Clearly, if you get certain types of wild yeast in your beer, it can do things that you don't want it to do. That's probably the other main issue.
So sanitation, very important.
Sanitation.
I think you mentioned cold storage too, right?
Cold storage is important. Sanitation, just rinse everything really thoroughly.
How do these various freshness contributors fit into the overall idea of perception? The perception of freshness.
Well, that's a really interesting question, because there's a brewery here near where I live that has been doing a barley wine for years, and these guys would get complaints every year when they put out their seasonal barley wine. The same people every year would call them up. My beer doesn't taste the same as the batch I have sitting right here from last year.
Gee,
what did you do? and so, what do you like? And if you're a home brewer, if you like something and we're telling you it's wrong, I say bravo, do it, because what really matters is what you like. And I think freshness is a perception issue. There are beers that I can get anywhere in the country that I absolutely love, craft breweries beers, and I know that I'm going to get really, really consistent quality. And there are craft beers that I get here close to home, that are brewed close to home, where I get really inconsistent quality. And so I think consistency is the key, and that's what working on freshness and doing things around oxidation will help you with significantly, is consistency.
Yeah, the classic example I like is the Belgian lambic. They start with stale hops, and then they fermented in an open fermenter with wild yeast, and then they age it for a year and then mix it with other beer that came from somewhere else.
Yeah.
But it creates an amazing set of flavors.
It's pretty interesting.
It's like they do everything I was taught not to do, and it comes out fine.
Well, and it's like the whole. If you ask a brewer about the whole cork and cage thing, and cork and cage is getting to be a big perceptual difference from the consumer, but the brewers kind of look at it strictly as a marketing thing, and from their standpoint, it's not really doing anything positively or negatively to the beer. It's just makes it look like a better experience, and maybe it is.
We had Charlie Bamforth on one time, and he actually did an experiment where he took two beers that were the same beer, really, and put one of them on a brand name mat and one of them not on a brand name mat. They were both stale beers, and universally, the one that was on the brand name mat was rated higher by people.
Well, when I started drinking when I became legal age to drink beer, which was back in the early 1980s.
Last year, right?
Yeah, right. Exactly. There wasn't anything available in the area except the big three and Pabst and things like that. And we probably drank the most abysmal beers that there were because they had the most flavor.
Malt liquors?
No, not malt liquors, but I'm not going to name any names. Let's just put it that way.
They were inexpensive, right?
Not even necessarily that. I think, they were considered the premium beers at the time, but knowing what I know now about what was going on in those breweries 10 years after that in terms of oxygen content and things like that, they just weren't beers that were packaged well, and they probably had a lot of other brewing issues in terms of yeast management and things like that. So, but nonetheless, we liked them because they had the most flavor. So there's no accounting for taste sometimes.
Yeah. Here's a good question for you. What does a stale beer taste like? One that's gone bad due to oxygen, for example. How could you detect that off flavor?
Well, gosh, unless, that's an interesting thing. There's a certain crispness. And when I say crispness, I'm not talking about
the holiday
carbon dioxide. No, I'm not talking about Christmas either. I'm not talking about sort of the effects of carbon dioxide, but there's a certain kind of crispness to it. They're like IPAs tend to get more bitter, and the flavors kind of go flat. I think for the most part, they can develop more sort of butterscotchy type flavors, diacetyl, things like that can
really?
Come out.
You get diacetyl from oxidizing beer?
You can get diacetyl over time in beer, yeah. So there's the one thing that people used to sort of call stale beer was sort of the cardboardy, which is caused by a compound called trans-2-noni now. But in fact, that's pretty much, I think, at this point been proven to be something that originates in the wort process. And there's there's debate about whether it originates in the boil or whether it originates from over or under oxygenation of the wort. But I think the latest studies that have been done and maybe the latest papers that are going to come out are going to show that it originates from the boil. But these guys did some work with carbon-14 testing and they imparted I don't know how they actually did this, but they basically did carbon-14 tracing of, okay, what happened in the beer through what periods of time, and it all originated back into the wort.
Interesting. While we're on the topic, I was wondering if you could explain maybe some of the other off flavors that you might get in beer and what some of the sources are.
Well, I think that the thing, that something that homebrewers might want to think really strongly about is whether or not they use brown bottles, clear bottles, or glass bottles, because the sort of skunky flavors that you get with beers like Heineken and Corona, where if you actually put it in a glass and smell the beer before you drink it, that's where you're going to find a lot of the aroma. It's going to be an aroma that really does smell like a skunk, and that's caused by photooxidation of hops, and the brown glass has UV filters that will keep the beer from photooxidizing, but the green and clear glass will not block out those UV light.
So your recommendation is which color?
Brown.
Definitely brown.
Definitely brown. Or a keg.
Or a keg. Yeah, kegs are pretty good. The stainless steel tends to block the UV light, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Charlie Bamforth wrote a great book recently that is sold by the ASBC called Flavor. And
we had him on. It was several episodes ago. We had him on to talk about that, actually.
Well, one of the kids that he talks about, this guy, Hobie, who is blind and is a taster. I met him as a teenager at his grandfather's birthday party, and he was drinking drinking Corona, and I was like, taste that skunky flavor? And he's like, yeah. I said, do you like it? And he said, yeah. and now if you read
lime in it, it's fine, right?
Yeah, exactly. And if you read now in Flavor, Charlie gives a few pages to him, and what a great sensory person he's become, and how much he works in the brewing and wine industry.
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, can you roll some of this up into some practical advice for an average home brewer?
So I think really the practical advice is, boil your water in the beginning. Boil it before you start adding ingredients. Get a good rolling boil.
So you're saying boil it even before you add any extract or anything to it?
Exactly. Get as much of the oxygen out of there as you can.
Now, what if you're doing an all grain? Do you have to do that before you mash? I mean, for an extract, obviously you can get a good boil going before you add the extract.
I would.
Really? You'd actually boil the water before you put it in the mash?
Yeah. No, I don't know anything about home brewing, but from the standpoint of, okay, do I want to get all the O2 out, and how important is that? It might be important enough to do that.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. So get as much oxygen as you can out before the boil.
Before the boil. I mean, because you're starting, I measured the tap water here at my house last week, and it was over 10 parts per million of oxygen coming out of the tap. So as soon as that water starts boiling, it's going to drive the O2 out. And
most taps have a little aerator on them, don't they?
This one,
the kitchen faucet, for example.
Yeah, this one coming out of our faucet downstairs didn't. So, and I was going just right into a cup with it, and it was super saturated. Mm-hmm. So even if you had an aerator on it, it would only reach what is saturation, but this was above saturation, what was coming out of our tap. And I've seen water in places come out at 14, 15 parts per million. So that's a lot of O2.
Yeah, it is quite a bit. I mean, even going into, when you pitch your yeast, it's supposed to be like 9 or 10 parts per million is what I recall anyways. Somewhere between 8 and 10, I think. Or
I would think you could also pitch your yeast as long as you kept aerating afterward. But yeah, you'd pitching your yeast, you definitely want it to be as high as it
Yeah, generally you don't add any oxygen after you pitch the yeast because it can create problems actually.
Okay. Yeah. But
go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I don't, that's interesting that you say that about pitching yeast, because I know some breweries who will put small amounts of air up into the fermenters after they, through a stone at the bottom after they've pitched the yeast.
It has to be very early in the fermentation, I would think, while it's still
very, very, absolutely, very in the first, minutes of the
while it's still in the growth phase. And if you're adding pure oxygen, you only have to add it for a minute or so. It doesn't take very long.
Right. Yep. Yeah, and you can get, any inexpensive oxygen analyzer will measure your aeration, so you don't have to go spend thousands and thousands of dollars. If you can pick something up on eBay that works at high levels, and you can kind of quantify it by, take some room temperature water and measure it. And if you're getting a number that's in the 8 to 10 parts per million range on water that you've stirred really well, probably that analyzer is probably working just fine. And then,
so how much does something like a little handheld unit like that cost if you get it on eBay?
I have no idea, to be honest with you.
Okay.
No, I don't. I knew that there are a few $100s to, you could probably pay as much as $1,500 for one, but I would think
outside my price range anyway.
Yeah, I would think you could pick something up on eBay pretty inexpensive.
I think an aquarium pump would be cheaper, but
probably so.
Okay, so you mentioned a couple things here. I was wondering if you had a few more tips on preserving the freshness of your beer.
Just flush out those bottles, flush out those kegs, and if you can get things to fob over, get them to fob over before you put the crowns on them. And definitely, there's no harm in using oxygen scavenging crowns. Probably for the number you're using, go ahead and use them. Be on the safe side. Use them because they're not going to cost your cost per crown if you're only if you're only filling 100 bottles and you're paying another couple bucks, it's not that much.
Right.
For potential insurance.
We're typically doing about 50. So, a package of them is 2 batches, really. Yeah. They typically sell 100 at a time.
Yeah. You're not talking about a lot of money there.
No, not at all. And then what about beer storage? Just your final tips there.
Anyway, the colder you can store it, the better. If you've got a dedicated refrigerator, store it at 40 degrees. If you don't, find the coolest place in your house and store it there.
Obviously out of the sunlight, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. You want to keep it, especially if you really wanted to use the green or the clear bottles, then keep them wrapped and keep the light out of them, and they'll be fine. They don't it's not like you can't use them. It's just you don't want to expose them to light for probably more than about 30 minutes, or they can start picking up that skunky flavor.
Yeah, I keep all my bottles typically in a box when I'm storing them, unless they're in the fridge.
Yeah. Yeah, even fridge lights can do it. If you've got green or clear bottles, and you take your Heineken out of the overwrap and put it in the fridge, and opening and closing the fridge over the course of the week, it gets enough exposure that you're going to start to get some skunky flavor.
You're actually getting UV light off the fridge light.
You're getting enough. I don't think it takes much. I knew a guy who was a super taster. He worked for Heilman. And he was a super skunk taster, and he couldn't drink beer in a glass out in the sunshine, because by the time he finished it, it would be too skunky for him.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's happening.
That's pretty bad. I mean, I enjoy a beer on a nice day,
Absolutely, in a clear glass.
So should I go buy brown glassware for my glasses then?
I don't think that would be very appealing somehow.
I guess I'd go with Steins, right?
Sure.
They're pretty well covered there.
Yeah.
So where can somebody learn a little bit more about these topics?
Well, if you're brave enough and want to learn about dissolved gases, then go to my blog, tapintohock.com.
Hock. I said hatch. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
H-A-C-H.
H-A-C-H.
Tap into hach.com.
Yep. And that's, if you're interested in like sort of what are brewers reading, go to the ASBC. I think it's asbcnet.org. Mm-hmm. And you can look at the books that are for sale there and buy them from that website or wherever. But I think it would kind of tell you, okay, what do brewers value in terms of books to read? And
yep, I'm pulling it up here now.
And keep learning and just enjoy it. It's a fun profession, and it's a fun thing to do. And I think it really brings people. The homebrewers I know are wonderful people, and it's a great group of people to hang out with.
I'm kind of passionate about our beer.
You are. You absolutely are.
I like that. Well, is there anything else you want to add?
No, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to join you, and it's been a fun conversation.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate you being here. And again, today my guest is Mr. Chaz Benedict. Chaz is a manager at Hatch Company. He spent decades studying oxygen in beer, and he's a member of the American Society of Brewing Chemists Technical Committee. And of course, his website, I'm going to pull it up one more time here, is Tap Into Hock. Did I say that right?
You said that right.
Okay. Tap into Hock, H-A-C-H, tap into HACH.com. Great to have you. Thanks a lot for being on the show.
Thanks, Brad. It's been fun.
Well, a big thank you to Chaz Benedict for joining this week. A reminder for you to join the discussion group at beersmith.com/forum. It's free to sign up, and you can instantly start sharing with over 23,000 members. Again, that's beersmith.com/forum. And thanks also to our new sponsor, Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine at beerandbrewing.com. Grab a copy of their first magazine issue. It's 120 pages. Or sign up for a 1 or 2 year subscription by visiting beerandbrewing.com. Finally, if you haven't done so, please sign up for my newsletter on the right sidebar at beersmith.com. I'll send you a high-quality article on homebrewing every single week, and I won't load your inbox up with spam. I would like to thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great brewing week.